Hello, and welcome back to my basement. I want to play a little exercise with you guys. Think of any disaster movie, just the first disaster movie that comes to your mind. The first one that popped in your head, what was it? I mean, I can't hear you, so I don't know what you said, but the likelihood that the movie that you named is from the 1990s or early 2000s is pretty high. If you look up a list of the best disaster movies of all time, these lists will include movies from the 1990s and early 2000s like Armageddon, Twister, Independence Day, The Day After Tomorrow, more than disaster movies from any other era. So why is this? I mean, you could chalk it up to recency bias, but no one's talking about, San Andreas or Moonfall. So why do people still talk so much about these disaster movies from the 1990s, more so than they do about disaster movies from before that? I mean, sure, there still is some talk about earlier disaster movies like Towering Inferno or something. I mean, people still bring those up in conversation. So what gives? Where did this trend of big budget disaster movies come from, and why were they so prevalent in the 1990s? Also, where did they go? Why don't we still go to watch big budget disaster movies in the theaters or on Netflix or something anymore?
Before we talk about the rise of these types of films, let's take a look at where this trend originated from. I mean, that's not as easy as it sounds. Disaster movies have existed as a concept for almost as long as film itself. One of the earliest known examples of a disaster being depicted on screen was in the silent film Fire from 1901. However, disaster movies are not just about showing disasters. No, they're about showing people being affected by it.
That's part of what makes disaster movies so appealing. People don't just watch disaster movies because they want to see some big disaster unfold. I mean, that's part of it, but another part of it is the human aspect. People like to see how the real world and real people living in the real world would be affected by this disaster. Into the 1930s, disaster movies were about real events. The film San Francisco from 1936 depicted the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and Old Chicago from 1937 depicted the Great Chicago Fire. Showing real events rather than purely fictional ones probably allowed the audience to empathize with these characters more, since these were relatively recent events. After all, relating to the characters in the movie is one of the most important parts of these movies. If you can't relate to the characters in the movies, the events being shown won't hold as much weight. They're just going to feel like pictures moving on a screen, not actually something that's really happening.
Into the 1950s and 60s, science fiction films were all the rage. These films often included some sort of disaster in them, but these disasters were often not natural or man-made, but instead due to some outside force like aliens or giant monsters. However, there were still some straightforward disaster movies. These movies often incorporated elements having to do with nuclear or atomic bombs, since this was the age of the Cold War when these threats were constantly on the horizon. Tapping into the people's current fears of the time allowed the movies to feel more intriguing, and again, allowed the audience to be more empathetic to the characters in the film. Into the 1970s, disaster films were becoming increasingly popular, starting with the film Airport in 1970, which many would consider to be the first modern disaster movie and spawned a load of sequels. There was an onslaught of films covering all sorts of disasters, natural disasters like in the film Poseidon Adventures, to man-made disasters like in the film Towering Inferno. No stone was left unturned.
This was an incredibly prosperous time for disaster movies. Like always, the movies relied heavily on the characters within them. They usually featured a large ensemble cast that all dealt with the disaster in their own ways. These movies were really popular for a reason. They balanced this large spectacle of a disaster, any disaster really, whether it be natural or man-made, with these very realistic characters, and showed how these very realistic characters reacted to the situation going on around them. It really allowed people to empathize and relate to these characters and be like, whoa, what if this was me? You know, this was the first time this formula was really perfected. These films did so well because the events in them did not seem outside of the realm of possibilities. It was really tapping into people's worst fears, because these things could happen to anyone, and that's what these movies showed.
As the 1970s progressed, this genre got oversaturated. People simply wanted to see something more original, and the onslaught of sequels and unoriginal disaster movies were simply not filling that need. With the release of the parody film Airplane in 1980, the general consensus around these types of movies was clear. People did not care anymore. Sure, there were some disaster movies in the 1980s and early 90s, but none reached the peaks of the 1970s disaster film craze. However, nearly 15 years later, these types of movies had a revival of sorts.
These new disaster films kept what made a lot of the 70s disaster films so good. Big budget action films with huge spectacles like Armageddon, Twister, or Independence Day still had characters you could really care about. This new wave of disaster films wasn't really a new wave at all, it was just a resurrection of the old wave. The only difference is that these films had a lot better and more realistic effects due to the heavy use of CGI in these films. Without the original formula, these films likely would have not existed at all. These films are just a testament to how good that original formula was. These films also paid homage to a lot of the earlier disaster movies, even before the 70s. A lot of these new disaster movies incorporated some sci-fi elements like the films from the 50s and 60s.
These films weren't short-lived either. Into the 2000s, films like The Core, The Day After Tomorrow, and 2012 were all successful disaster films. However, like the 1970s disaster films before them, this new craze had to end sometime, and it seems like that time was the 2010s, with the beginning of the new decade. Disaster films just weren't in vogue anymore. I mean, sure, films like Geostorm, San Andreas, or Into the Storm continue to try this formula to moderate success, but they didn't reach the same heights as earlier films. And with the release of 2020's Moonfall, it is clear that the age of disaster films, or at least these types of disaster films, is just no more.
However, there is still hope for these disaster movies, at least in my opinion. These films were so popular because of the formula, of course, that was already perfected in the 70s, but also the new emergence of CGI. Emergence of this new technology allowed people to be intrigued in these films. Like, whoa, this looks realistic. This looks like something that is really happening to these characters. The reason why people like these films so much is because they are realistic. But as with all new things, the allure wears off after a while, and the allure of CGI has worn off by now. You know, this isn't a disaster movie, but Avatar 2009 was so popular because it was a big tech demo, but I really doubt Avatar 2 is gonna bring all the people back to the theaters. I don't think that people really care that much about CGI anymore because it's been around for so long, and so many films use it now, it's just a part of the film landscape. So when these films are basically reliant on an old formula from the 70s, and a technology that's not outdated, but it's kind of just, you know, normalcy now, it's definitely not going to be as popular as it once was when this technology was new and groundbreaking. But I do think if filmmakers incorporate new ideas into these disaster movies, that they can become popular once again. I do feel like the disaster movie formula is still being incorporated into the modern film landscape. Superhero movies are the big hot thing right now, and a lot of those movies incorporate disaster movies elements. A lot of them are about a large-scale disaster happening. If it wasn't for the disaster movie formula, a lot of these films wouldn't exist in the same way they do today. Even if they're not full-fledged disaster movies, they still incorporate disaster elements. The industry constantly shares ideas from the past and pulls them back in and breathes new light into them. That's what the 90s resurgence of disaster movies was all about, taking something that's old and making it feel new. And that could happen again, maybe with disaster movies, maybe with another old genre that people don't care about anymore. I do not know. But the one thing I do know for sure is that this video is over. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day. If you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe, because, you know, you'll see more of my videos, and that's cool. I think it's cool. Goodbye.